Welcome to the deep dive. We're going really deep today, international politics. You've given me quite the reading list to start with.
Well, looks like someone wants to get past the headlines and understand how the world really works.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, who doesn't, right?
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by how all the pieces fit together.
I think you're going to enjoy this then. It starts with, well, the state. But it's not boring, I promise.
Oh, okay, good.
That's
I was about to say.
No, it kicks off by comparing states to get this animals defending their territory.
Okay, that got my attention. Animals.
Right. It connects how animals protect their space to how states guard their sovereignty. Like that instinct to control territory is built into the very idea of what a state IS is.
So it's more than just lines on a map then, huh?
Way more. It breaks down the 4 things a state has to have. Territory, population, government, and then sovereignty. You need all of them. Space, people, someone in charge, and the right to, well, be in charge.
You know, that makes you think about places that call themselves states, but maybe they don't have it all.
You're already thinking like a political scientist. And that actually leads perfectly into this tension the reading brings up between, well, national self-determination, meaning everyone who sees themselves as a nation should get their own state, versus, the fact that most states have all sorts of groups in them.
Yeah, it's like when empires break up and suddenly you have a bunch of new countries trying to figure out their identity, right?
Spot on. And the reading uses examples, newer countries especially, trying to create this national identity, even though they have tons of different languages or religions inside their borders.
Almost like baking a cake with way too many ingredients. Sometimes it just won't hold together.
Haha. Love that. Okay, so we know states are the, let's call them players on the world stage, but what makes them do things? That's where national interest comes in.
Ah, yes, national interest. This is something I've always found a bit fuzzy. Whose interest is it exactly? What the people want? Or the government? Or, I don't know, big businesses?
Such a good question. The reading really makes you think about what national interest even means. Like, is it just one thing? Or many things? And is it like a fact? Or just what someone decides it is? There are at least 3 ways to look at it, it says. Economic interest, ideological, and then moral.
So a country might act based on what's good for its economy or its beliefs or what it sees as morally right.
Exactly. But often those things see a lash, right? Imagine there's a humanitarian crisis somewhere. Sending aid, that's the moral thing, but it costs money, hurts the economy. And then what if that country has an ideology of, say, staying out of other people's business?
It's like they're constantly juggling, trying to pick which thing is most important in that moment.
Right. And the reading gives some great examples from history. States picking one interest over others, and sometimes it backfires in spectacular ways. It makes you look at not just what they did, but why.
I'm already seeing the news differently.
Yeah.
But hold on. The reading mentions non-state actors. That means there are other players besides countries.
You bet. It makes it clear that states aren't the only ones with influence anymore. Now you have the UN, NGOs, big companies, even terrorist groups, all pushing their own agendas.
Like, the system's gotten way more crowded and complicated.
Haha, that's a great way to put it. It highlights how important organizations like the UN have become, especially in peacekeeping. And we can't forget NGOs, they really shape how people think about issues.
It makes you wonder if that means states are losing some of their power in this new world.
Oh, that's a good one. The reading kind of hints at that, and I think it's something we'll be thinking about as we go deeper.
So we've got states with their own interests and all these other groups trying to make an impact. But how do they actually make things happen?
Now we get to the good stuff, power. And one thing the reading emphasizes is it's not all about military anymore. There's this whole other side, soft power, they call it.
Soft power. Sounds kind of gentle.
Yeah, it can be. But it's powerful. It's the ability to get others to do what you want without forcing them, more through like your culture or diplomacy, making them want to follow your lead. The reading uses the example of nuclear deterrence during the Cold War.
Wait, how is having thousands of nukes soft?
Right. Seems like a contradiction, but think about it. The US and Soviet Union, they both could have destroyed each other many times over. But that very threat, the fear, stopped either one from actually doing it. Power from the potential for force, not force itself.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing when you put it that way. So power is more about strategy and perception, not just brute strength.
Exactly. And the reading talks about all sorts of views on power. Yes, military and economy are important, but also things like diplomacy, how stable your country is, even your reputation in the world.
I'm starting to realize power in international politics is way more complicated than just who has the biggest army.
Oh, for sure. It's constantly shifting, and that's why it's so interesting to study. But you've got to understand how it works to understand how states interact and get things done.
Okay, so we've got these power dynamics going on. But states can't just go around bossing each other around all the time, right? There's got to be some way to manage how they interact.
And that's where diplomacy comes in. The reading makes it really clear diplomacy is about managing both cooperation and conflict between states. It's about finding ways to talk, negotiate, sometimes even compromise to get what they want.
I can only imagine that's a tough balancing act, especially when countries have totally opposite goals.
Absolutely. And the reading goes into the different types of diplomacy: bilateral, just two countries talking, versus multilateral, where it's a whole group at the table, and even the difference between open diplomacy, where everything's out in the open, and closed diplomacy, all hush-hush behind closed doors.
So sometimes it's about public pressure, getting everyone on board, and sometimes it's about those quiet backroom deals you hear about.
Exactly. And the reading even gives you a peek at what diplomats do, their tactics. Persuasion, bargaining, even using sanctions to try and force another country to change. It's like having a whole toolbox and you got to pick the right tool for each job.
This is making diplomacy sound like a high-stakes game. A lot riding on every move.
Oh, it absolutely is. But it's also the key to keeping those power struggles from turning into wars. Diplomacy is like the first line of defense in keeping the world stable, as much as it can be anyway.
I'm loving how all these ideas connect. States, power, national interest, diplomacy. Like, we're starting to see the gears turning in this whole global system.
You're getting it. And honestly, the reading does a fantastic job of laying it all out so you can see how the pieces fit together. It's like having a map to navigate all the complexity.
Way better than just reading headlines, that's for sure. But with all these different players and their goals, is there any sense of order? Are there rules to the game?
Excellent question. And that leads us to the next big idea the reading tackles: international law. It might seem weird talking about law when there's no world government or global police to enforce it, right?
So how does international law even work then?
Now that's a puzzle, isn't it? It goes into where international law comes from. Treaties, which are like formal agreements between countries. Then you have customs, things countries have just done for so long, everyone expects it. And then there are these general principles, legal ideas most countries agree on, even if they're not written down somewhere.
So it's like a patchwork of agreements, norms, things everyone kind of understands.
Exactly. And yeah, it might look flimsy compared to like the laws inside a country, but international law does matter. The reading even talks about why states follow it, even if there's no one to punish them if they don't.
Why would they bother if there's no punishment? Doesn't make sense at first.
It's a question people have debated forever. The reading gives a few reasons. One is reciprocity, the idea that if you follow the rules, others will too. It builds trust, makes things more predictable, even in this crazy system.
So even if there's no referee, it's in everyone's best interest to play by the rules, at least most of the time.
Exactly. Then there's reputation. Countries that break the rules all the time, well, they get a bad rep. Other countries don't trust them, don't want to work with them, might even get hit with sanctions or other penalties.
Ouch, that's like a bad credit score, but for the whole country, I guess.
Perfect analogy. And lastly, the reading says sometimes countries follow the rules simply because it benefits them. If a treaty helps them achieve their own goals, well, they're happy to stick to it.
So it's not always about being good. Sometimes it's just good business.
You got it. So international law isn't perfect, that's for sure. But it does create some kind of framework for cooperation, for holding each other accountable, even when states want different things.
This is seriously changing how I view the news. It's like we're seeing behind the curtain now.
And we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore: how the system actually functions, what makes it break down, and where it all might be heading in the future.
I'm ready for more. Let's keep diving in.
You bet. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll really start dissecting how states interact on the world stage.
All right, ready to dive back in. Last time, we talked about states, power, diplomacy, even international law. Like, we laid the groundwork, but now I want to see how the whole structure actually works.
Well, get ready, because the next part of this reading gets into the nitty-gritty of statehood and sovereignty. And it starts by saying, sovereignty, it's not just some idea. It really affects how states act.
So it's more than just waving a flag at the UN, huh?
Way more. It explains that sovereignty has, like, two sides: principle and then practice. In principle, a state is the boss of its own turf. Nobody else gets to butt in, that's the idea.
So kind of like being king of your own castle.
Right. But, and here's the catch, You got to be able to rule that castle, right? A state might say it's sovereign, but if it can't control what happens inside its borders, well, it's not really in charge, is it?
It's like claiming to be captain of a ship, but you can't actually steer it. Doesn't really matter what you call yourself.
Exactly. And the reading points out this difference between what a state says and what it does. It's really obvious when you think about how some states are just way more powerful than others.
Yeah, not all states are created equal, unfortunately.
Nope. Some states, because of their money, their military, or even just their influence, they can actually do a lot more. It's like some states have a louder voice in the world, their actions matter more.
And that can lead to situations where smaller, weaker states get pushed around by the bigger ones, right? Their sovereignty isn't really respected.
Oh, absolutely. The reading gives some pretty eye-opening examples of this, showing how states are always pushing and pulling, testing the limits of sovereignty in the real world.
This is really making me rethink how I see the world. Sovereignty isn't just this simple thing. It's constantly changing, depending on who has the power.
That's a key point. The reading wants you to think critically about it. Sovereignty is messy. It's always being shaped by all these forces in international politics.
Okay, so we've got these states, each trying to be sovereign, each with their own goals. But how do they even decide what those goals are? That's where national interest comes in, right?
You got it. And the reading goes deep on this. Because let's be honest, national interest, it's kind of a slippery concept. What does it even mean? Is it just one thing a country wants? Or a bunch of things? And who gets to decide what it is, anyway?
It's like trying to define happiness. Everyone has a different idea.
Great analogy. And the reading suggests that, yeah, there are probably as many national interests as there are people defining it. It depends on what you value, what you believe, what you think is best for your country.
So you can't just say, this is what's good for America, because different Americans might have very different ideas about what good even is.
Exactly. The reading talks about different lenses through which people view national interests, like economic factors, that's a big one. Then there's ideology, your beliefs about how the world should work. And then there's moral principles, what you see as right and wrong.
Okay, so let's break those down. Economic interests seem pretty straightforward. Wanting a strong economy, good trade deals, that kind of thing.
Right. But even within economics, you get conflicts. Should a country focus on free trade or protecting its own industries? Should it go for short-term profits or think about the environment, the long term? It gets complicated fast.
It's like a puzzle where every piece you move affects all the other pieces.
Exactly. Then you have ideology. Like, if a country believes it needs to spread democracy around the world, that's going to affect how it acts, right? Different from a country that just wants to be left alone.
So a country that sees itself as a defender of human rights is going to act differently than a country that just wants to be powerful.
You got it. Their foreign policy, their alliances, even who they go to war with, it's all influenced by those core beliefs. And then you have moral considerations, like should a country intervene in a genocide somewhere else, even if it has nothing to gain from it?
So sometimes countries DO things because they believe it's the right thing to do, even if it costs them money or puts them at risk.
Sometimes, yeah. Moral principles can be a really powerful force in international relations, sometimes even more than economic or strategic interests. The reading gives some really interesting examples of this.
Wow, this is really making me think about international relations in a different way. It's not just about power and strategy, it's also about values and beliefs.
Exactly. And the reading is pushing you to see how all of these things interact, economic interests, ideology, moral principles, to understand why states do what they do.
Okay, so we've got these states, each with their own messy idea of national interest, all trying to navigate this complex system. But how do they actually make things happen? I mean, besides diplomacy, which we talked about before.
Now we get to the heart of it, power dynamics. The reading really goes deep into how power works in international relations, and it stresses that it's way more complex than just counting tanks and missiles.
I remember from last time you mentioned this idea of soft power, right? Persuasion instead of force.
Right, and the reading builds on that by giving us some really important insights into how power itself works.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, first, it says power is relational. It's not something a country has on its own. It's always in comparison to other countries. So it's not just about how strong you are, it's about how strong everyone is.
So a country might look powerful by itself, but if it's surrounded by bigger, stronger countries, it's not really that powerful after all.
Exactly. It's like a high school basketball team that wins all its games, but they wouldn't last 5 minutes against a professional team. Context matters. Then, the reading points out that power is situational. What works in one situation might not work in another.
So a country might have a huge economy, but a weak military. Or maybe they're really strong militarily, but vulnerable to cyber attacks.
Exactly. Different types of power matter, more or less, depending on what's happening. It's like rock, paper, scissors, but with countries.
I love that analogy. Okay, so power is relational, it's situational. What else?
The last thing the reading highlights is that power is often perceptual. It's not just about what you can do, it's about what other countries think you can do.
So like a country could bluff, make itself seem tougher than it really is.
All the time. If you can convince others that you're willing to use your power, they might back down even if you never actually do anything. It's like playing poker. A well-timed bluff can win the whole pot.
Wow, this is blowing my mind. Power is a lot more subtle and complicated than I ever realized.
For sure. And the reading wants you to see beyond just military strength. There are all these layers to power: relational, situational, perceptual, and understanding those is key to understanding how international relations really work.
Wow, part 2 was intense. We really dug into the mechanics of it all, states, power, how they use it. It feels like we zoomed way in on how this whole system works.
And now it's time to zoom back out, see the bigger picture, right? Because this document, it doesn't just explain the rules. It tackles some of the biggest issues facing, well, everyone in the 21st century.
Exactly. We've talked about how the game is played, but what about the playing field itself? How does all this affect things like, global development or human rights?
Well, the document makes it clear those things are woven into everything we've talked about so far. It starts with world development, but right away it wants you to think about, the history of inequality. Where did it all come from?
Okay, now that's interesting. Tell me more.
It takes you back, way back. Colonialism, the Industrial Revolution, how wealth and power ended up concentrated in certain parts of the world. It's like, you got to understand the game's history to see how we got to the score we have now.
So we're not just looking at who's rich and who's poor today, but how that happened in the first place.
Exactly. And it doesn't shy away from the tough stuff, like how colonialism straight up exploited a lot of the world, leaving behind poverty that's still there. And even the Industrial Revolution, yeah, it brought progress, but it also made inequality worse, both within countries and between them.
It's like a reminder that the world started off uneven, and we're still dealing with the consequences.
Big time. And the document makes you think about the things that still hold countries back. Unstable governments, corruption, people not having access to education, healthcare. And it looks at these big organizations like the IMF or World Bank that are supposed to help.
But do they actually help? Or are they part of the problem?
That's the question, isn't it? It wants you to think critically about them. Are they really making things better, especially for the people who need it most?
Man, this is making me see how it's all connected. Politics, economics, history, they all come together to shape whether a country develops or not.
That's exactly what it's getting at. World development, it's not some side issue. It's at the heart of the international politics.
Okay, so we've got development. But what about human rights? Where do those fit in?
Well, the document argues that human rights are more important now than ever. It goes through how this idea has evolved from, the aftermath of World War II, the Holocaust, this realization that some things are just wrong no matter where you live.
So it's like saying the government can't just do whatever it wants to its own people anymore. There are limits.
Right. It talks about all the agreements and treaties that have come out of that, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all these rules about free speech, no torture, things like that.
Like building a global legal system to protect everyone, no matter what country they're in.
Exactly. But it also acknowledges the tension between that and state sovereignty. If a country is committing atrocities, should other countries interfere? That's where humanitarian intervention comes in, which we touched on before.
Yeah, that seems like a really tough call. On one hand, you want to help people. On the other, who are WE to tell another country what to do?
Right. It's a dilemma that has no easy answers. The document lays out all the different arguments, the risks of getting involved, the risks of not getting involved. It really makes you think.
This is definitely making me question my own assumptions, If I was in charge, faced with that situation, I don't know what I'd do. It's heavy stuff.
It has, and that's the point. This document doesn't just give you facts, it makes you confront these big moral questions, figure out where you stand on them.
This whole deep dive has been so much more than I thought it would be. I'm seeing the world differently now, not just the politics, but the ethical side of it all.
And that's what makes this field so important. It's not just theories, it's about real people, real choices, and the kind of future we're building together.
So, Okay, we've covered a lot. Historical inequality, human rights, these big challenges. But where do we go from here? What does the future hold for this whole system?
Well, no one has a crystal ball, right? But the document does point out some key trends, like the rise of new powers, especially in Asia. The balance of power in the world is shifting.
So it's not just America and Europe running the show anymore.
Nope. It highlights China, India, their economies and militaries are growing fast, and that's changing everything. Like, the whole map of global power is being redrawn.
It's exciting, but kind of scary too, right? Who knows what'll happen?
Exactly. And the document makes you think about what this means for everything. Trade, security, climate change, even human rights. The whole world's got to figure out how to deal with this new reality.
Okay, shifting power. What else is coming our way?
It also talks about these problems that cross borders. They call them transnational challenges. Climate change is the big one, but also pandemics, terrorism, cybercrime, stuff that one country can't solve on its own, no matter how powerful they are.
It's like we're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
Right. And it argues that these challenges, they're putting a strain on the old system where it was just states dealing with each other. Now you have all these other groups like NGOs getting involved, and states have to cooperate more, even if they don't want to.
So it's not just about competition anymore. It's about working together to solve these huge problems.
Exactly. It's like the document saying the world is getting more complex, more interconnected. The old ways of doing things might not work anymore.
This has been an incredible journey. We started with states and power, and we ended up talking about the fate of the whole planet. It's made me realize how much we all depend on each other and how important it is to understand how the system works.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This document, it really shows you the power of knowledge. When we understand how things work, we can make better choices, have better conversations, and hopefully build a better world. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
It's been mind-blowing, that's for sure. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the world around you.
Yeah.